What they didn't know was that a private investigator had been sitting 3 tables away the entire evening, recording every word on a small device no larger than a pen. What they didn't know was that my father, 89 years old, sharp as a blade, and worth somewhere north of $310 million, was watching from the head table with the patience of a man who had already made up his mind. I've thought about that night 1,000 times since it happened. The way the chandelier light caught the crystal glasses. The way the string quartet played something soft and elegant in the corner while my daughter looked right through me like I was part of the furniture. The way my son-in-law leaned over to his college friend and said, just loud enough for the table to hear, I honestly don't know why she invited him. He looks like he drove here from a hardware store. The table laughed. I didn't say a word. My name is Robert. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer. Built infrastructure across 5 states, managed projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and retired quietly 2 years ago to a small house in Asheville, North Carolina, where I grow tomatoes in the backyard and take long walks in the morning. I drive a 2009 Ford F-150 with 240,000 miles on it. I wear Carhartt on weekdays and whatever clean shirt I can find on the weekends. I don't own a suit that costs more than $150. And I have never once felt the need to apologize for that. My daughter's name is Vanessa. She's 34. She married a man named Christopher Aldridge, the second he insists on the second, at a venue outside Charleston, South Carolina, on a Saturday in late October. The venue was a plantation-style estate with white columns and manicured gardens, and a catering bill, I later learned, came to just over $80,000. Christopher's parents contributed $40,000. My father, Vanessa's grandfather, a man named Harold Mercer, contributed the rest, quietly, through a family trust. Because that is how my father has always operated, quietly, deliberately, and always with purpose. I found out about the wedding the way most fathers find out about things they were never meant to know fully. My daughter called me 7 weeks before the date, told me the time and location, gave me a dress code description that amounted to nice, I guess, whatever you have, and told me she'd see me there. No conversation about walking her down the aisle. No discussion about the father-daughter dance. I asked about both, gently, and she said Christopher's stepfather, a man named Gerald who had been in her life for 4 years, would be handling those honors. I said okay. I said it the way I've said okay to a lot of things over the past decade, with the kind of quiet that isn't defeat, but rather the accumulation of understanding. Vanessa had been pulling away from me since her mother and I divorced when she was 22. Her mother, my ex-wife Carol, had done what some people do after a marriage ends. She'd rewritten the history. In her version, I was the distant father, the man who cared more about work than family, the one who was never really present, even when he was physically in the room. Vanessa had absorbed that version the way a plant absorbs water, slowly, completely, and without questioning the source. I didn't fight it. Maybe I should have. I've asked myself that question more times than I can count. But I believed, and I still believe, that fighting over a child's loyalty is one of the most corrosive things a divorced parent can do. So I stepped back. I called. I sent birthday cards. I showed up when I was allowed to show up. And I watched my daughter grow into a woman who had inherited her mother's ability to categorize people by their usefulness and their presentation. Christopher was exactly the kind of man Carol would have approved of. He worked in finance, wore tailored suits, drove a black BMW, and spoke about money the way some people speak about religion, reverently, constantly, as the central organizing principle of his existence. He'd never asked me a single question about my work, my life, or my opinions. In the 2 years I'd known him, our conversations had been limited to weather, sports scores, and the one time he asked me if I knew anything about stock options, then interrupted my answer to take a phone call. But Vanessa loved him, or seemed to, and so I drove 9 hours from Asheville to Charleston in my F-150 with a card in my glove compartment containing a check for $3,000, more than I'd comfortably spend, but what a father does, and a garment bag in the back seat containing the best thing I owned. A dark navy blazer I'd bought 4 years ago for my nephew's graduation, a white dress shirt, pressed slacks, and shoes I'd polished the night before for 45 minutes. I thought I looked fine. I arrived at the venue at 4 in the afternoon for the 5 o'clock ceremony. The parking lot was already filling up with late-model luxury cars. I parked my truck at the far end of the lot, put on my blazer in the cab, checked my reflection in the visor mirror, and walked toward the entrance, feeling the way I usually feel, unremarkable, comfortable, and completely at peace with who I am. The first sign that the evening would go the way it did came from the seating coordinator. A young woman with a clipboard met me at the entrance, asked my name, and then looked at her list with an expression she was trying very hard to control. She walked me inside, past tables draped in white linen with towering floral arrangements and gold-rimmed place settings, past the main seating area, past the secondary area, to a table near the far corner of the room adjacent to the kitchen entrance, partially obscured by a decorative partition, and set for 8 people, none of whom I recognized. My name card read, Robert Mercer, table 14. There were 13 tables between me and the head table where my daughter would sit. I found my seat, sat down, introduced myself to the strangers around me, a distant cousin of Christopher's from Ohio, a co-worker of Vanessa's I'd never met, an elderly woman who appeared to have come with the wrong invitation, and I waited. The ceremony was held outdoors. As the sun went down, it was genuinely beautiful. Vanessa looked stunning in her gown. And I will say this without any bitterness. Watching her walk down that aisle, even on Gerald's arm, even with everything that had happened and everything that was about to happen, she was radiant. She was my daughter, and whatever had grown between us, or failed to grow, that moment was real. I cried a little. I don't care who knows that. At the reception, I stayed at table 14. I ate the salmon. I drank 2 glasses of the wine, which was genuinely excellent. I spoke to the Ohio cousin about the Cleveland Browns and to the coworker about project management software. I was having, against all reasonable expectation, a reasonably decent time when Christopher's college friend, a man named Bryce, came over to our table to find someone he was looking for. Didn't find them, and instead paused to look at me with the particular expression of someone encountering something they find mildly confusing. "You're Vanessa's dad?" he said. "I am," I said. He looked at my blazer. He looked at my shoes. He looked back at my face. Then he called across to Christopher, who was standing 20 feet away near the bar with a drink in his hand and a circle of similarly dressed men around him. "Hey, Chris, is this your father-in-law?" Christopher turned. He looked at me for a moment, then said, loud enough for his group and mine and probably the kitchen staff to hear, "That's him, yeah. Robert from Asheville." He said Asheville the way people say the name of a place they've driven through and immediately forgotten. We put him near the kitchen so he'd feel at home. The group laughed. Bryce laughed. The co-worker at my table looked at her plate. I picked up my wine glass and took a sip. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because it matters. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel humiliation in the way they intended it, that collapsing, chest-tightening sensation of being made small. What I felt was something cooler and more certain. The feeling of a man who has been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for something to crystallize completely. And now it had. What I also felt, across the room, without looking directly, was the weight of my father's attention. My father, Harold Mercer, was seated at table 1, near the head table, in the place of honor typically reserved for the most significant family elder. He was 89 years old, thin and upright, with white hair and the kind of face that has been weathered into something almost geological. He was wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Christopher's car, and he was, at that moment, looking at his grandson-in-law with an expression I had seen exactly twice in my life. Once, when a contractor tried to defraud him in 1987. Once, when my brother made a business decision my father had explicitly advised against, which cost the family $4 million. The expression was not anger. It was assessment, the quiet, complete, irreversible assessment of a man who is deciding something and has nearly decided it. I should tell you about my father, because without understanding him, none of what follows will make the kind of sense it deserves to make. Harold Mercer grew up in rural Georgia, the son of a sharecropper, and left home at 17 with $40 in a suitcase. He spent his 20s doing work that would have broken most men: construction, labor, long-haul trucking, any physical work that paid. In his early 30s, he started a small logistics company in Atlanta with a single truck and a contract to deliver building materials. Over the next 40 years, through decisions I can only describe as the product of extraordinary discipline and the kind of patience that borders on the supernatural, he built that company into a regional logistics and real estate enterprise that employed over 800 people and generated revenues that I'm not authorized to discuss in detail, but which placed him comfortably among the most significant private wealth holders in the southeastern United States. My father grew up poor. He became rich. And the singular defining principle of how he operated in business, in family, in every human relationship was this. He believed that character revealed itself most clearly not in moments of success, but in moments of social pressure. Not how people acted when things were good, how they acted when they thought no one important was watching. He had told me this when I was 12 years old. He told me again when I graduated from college. He told me once more 3 years ago, when Vanessa's engagement was announced, and he sat across from me at my kitchen table in Asheville and said, "I'm going to the wedding, Robert, and I'm going to watch." I hadn't fully understood what he meant then. I understood it now. What I didn't know at the time, what I learned later from the investigator's report, was that my father had retained a private investigator named Dennis Carver approximately 4 months before the wedding. Dennis Carver specialized in family estate matters. His job at the wedding was not surveillance in the dramatic sense. He wasn't following people or searching bags. He was simply present, with a small audio recording device and a discreet camera, with instructions to document the behavior of the immediate family members across the course of the evening. My father was not a man who left things to memory. The evening continued. There were toasts. Gerald gave a toast about Vanessa that was genuinely warm and made people laugh in the right places. Christopher's father gave a toast that was mostly about Christopher. One of Vanessa's bridesmaids gave a toast that mentioned me once, in passing, as Vanessa's dad, who drove in from North Carolina. My father was not asked to speak. He had not been listed in the program. I later learned he had been introduced to Christopher's family as Vanessa's grandfather from Atlanta, with no further context, which was either a significant oversight or a deliberate omission, and given everything else about the seating arrangement, I had a clear sense of which one it was. My father sat through all of it. He ate his dinner. He spoke quietly to the people seated near him. He declined the champagne and drank sparkling water. He was the most composed person in the room. Around 9 o'clock, when the dancing had started and the formal portion of the evening had technically concluded, Christopher came to table 14 for the first and only time. He didn't sit down. He stood at the edge of the table with his hands in his pockets, loosened tie, slightly flushed from the champagne, and looked at me with the expression of a man doing something he considered a minor charitable act. "Hey, Robert," he said. "Glad you could make it. Long drive from wherever you are." "Asheville," I said. Right. Nice place. Small, but nice." He looked around the table. "You doing okay over here? Eating all right?" "Dinner was excellent," I said. He nodded slowly. Good. Hey, I wanted to mention, Vanessa's grandfather, the old guy near the front, he keeps asking people where you're sitting. You should probably go say hi. Save us the trouble of him wandering around." He said this with the air of someone asking a staff member to handle a minor logistical inconvenience. "I'll do that," I said. I found my father near the garden entrance, standing with a glass of sparkling water, watching the dance floor with the same quiet attention he'd maintained all evening. When he saw me approaching, something shifted in his face, not dramatically, but perceptibly. A small relaxation around the eyes. "Robert," he said. "Dad." We stood together for a moment without speaking, which is something we have always been able to do comfortably. Then he said, "How are you holding up?" "Fine," I said. "It's a beautiful evening." He looked at me carefully. "I put the check for the catering through the trust, as you know. $80,000. I also arranged for the venue through a contact I have in Charleston. I did both of these things at Vanessa's request when she came to see me in Atlanta in January. He paused. She did not mention to me, at the time, that you would be seated at table 14. I didn't say anything. She also did not mention, my father continued, in the same even tone he might use to discuss a quarterly report, that Christopher was planning to spend the summer in the Hamptons using the property access I extended through the trust agreement last year, nor that they had recently inquired about putting the trust-backed condo in Savannah in Christopher's name. I looked at him. Dennis showed me the preliminary documentation this morning, he said simply. We stood in silence for another moment. On the dance floor, Vanessa was dancing with Gerald, laughing at something he'd said, her dress catching the light beautifully. She looks happy, I said. She does, my father agreed. Happiness and wisdom don't always travel together. He set down his sparkling water on a nearby surface, adjusted the cuff of his jacket, and said, I'm going to ask for the microphone now, Robert. I want you to stand near the head table when I do. I looked at him. Don't argue with me, he said, though I hadn't said a word. I've been patient for a long time. Tonight, I watched a man make a joke at my son's expense in front of 200 people, and I watched my granddaughter not correct it, and I watched them put you at a table next to the kitchen like you were someone who wandered in from the parking lot. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I've made my decision. I made it some time ago, honestly. Tonight simply completed the file. The bandleader, who had apparently been approached earlier in the evening because my father, as I have mentioned, did not leave things to chance, handed over the microphone a few minutes later during a break between songs. Introducing the bride's grandfather, Mr. Harold Mercer, who would like to say a few words. There was polite applause. Christopher and Vanessa were near the center of the room. I had moved, as instructed, to stand near the head table. Christopher's eyes found me, briefly, with an expression of mild confusion, then moved to my father with polite neutrality. My father held the microphone the way a man holds a telephone naturally, without affectation, and looked out at the room with the unhurried ease of someone who has spoken in boardrooms for 50 years. I want to start, he said, by thanking everyone for being here this evening. A wedding is a gathering of everyone a family trusts most, everyone who has earned their place in these two lives. He paused just long enough. Which is precisely why I want to take a moment to talk about one person in this room who I don't believe has been honored the way he deserves to be honored tonight. The room settled into that particular quiet of people who sense that something real is about to be said. My son, Robert Mercer, is 63 years old. He spent 3 decades building things that most of the people in this room drive over, work inside, or depend on without knowing it. He did that work without complaint, without recognition, and without ever asking me for a single dollar, which, given what I have and who I am, represents a kind of integrity I want to name clearly because it is rare. He looked across the room toward table 14, and I watched 200 people turn to follow his gaze. He drove 9 hours to be here today. He sat at table 14 and he ate his dinner and he was kind to the people around him, and he did not make a single person uncomfortable. Which is more than I can say for everyone in this room. The silence was very complete now. Christopher had gone still in the way a person goes still when they realize the ground under them is different from what they thought. I'm 89 years old, my father continued, and I've spent most of my life building something. A company. A set of properties. A trust that currently holds assets valued at approximately $310 million. He said the number the way he would say any number precisely, without drama, as a fact. I've been thoughtful about what happens to those assets, and I've had good legal counsel for many years, and I finalized the terms of my estate plan 3 weeks ago. He looked out at the room with the same geological patience he'd maintained all evening. My son Robert is the sole trustee and primary beneficiary of the Harold Mercer Family Trust. Every property, every holding, every account, I want his daughter to know that. I want his new son-in-law to know that. And I want both of them to understand that the specific terms I finalized 3 weeks ago were not an accident of timing. He handed the microphone back to the bandleader. Congratulations to the bride and groom, he said. Robert, come stand with me. I walked across the room. I want to be honest about what I felt crossing that floor, with 200 faces tracking my movement. I did not feel triumphant. I'm not a triumphant person by nature. What I felt was something quieter and more durable, the feeling of being seen, accurately, by someone who has known me for 63 years and chose tonight to say so in front of everyone. I reached my father. He put his hand on my shoulder, briefly, the way he sometimes did when I was young, and then he let go. What happened at the table behind us, I didn't see directly. I heard it, in pieces, over the next several minutes. I heard Christopher's voice, low and tight, saying something to Vanessa. I heard Vanessa's voice, higher than normal. I heard the word grandfather, and then the word trust, and then a silence that had its own particular texture. One of the guests told me later that Christopher sat down heavily in his chair when my father finished speaking, and that the color left his face in a way that was visible from across the room. Another guest, the Ohio cousin, actually, who turned out to be surprisingly observant, told me that Vanessa had excused herself to the restroom and didn't come back for 11 minutes. My father and I sat together at a small table near the garden entrance for the remainder of the evening. He had a piece of the wedding cake, which he said was very good. I had coffee. We talked about the logistics company, about his health, about the tomatoes I was growing in Asheville. He asked me detailed questions about the varieties and the drainage situation in my backyard, and whether I'd tried adding crushed eggshells to the soil, and for the better part of an hour, we were just a father and son talking about gardening at a wedding in October. It was one of the better evenings I've spent in recent memory. Vanessa found me as people were beginning to leave. She came across the room in her wedding dress, slightly more deliberate in her movement than she'd been earlier in the evening, and stood in front of me with the expression of someone who has been rehearsing what they want to say and has since abandoned the rehearsal. "Dad," she said. "Vanessa." She looked at my father, who looked back at her with the same patient neutrality he'd maintained all night, and then she looked at me. "I didn't know," she said, "about the trust, about any of it." "I know you didn't," I said. "The table, the seating thing. Christopher handled the arrangements, and I didn't." She stopped. "That's not entirely true. I looked at the seating chart. I didn't change it. I appreciated that. The honesty of it, arriving late but arriving. Thank you for telling me that," I said. She stood there for a moment, and I could see her working through something, some recalibration of a story she'd been living inside for years. I know that feeling. It's not comfortable. It doesn't resolve quickly. "I'm glad you came," she said finally. "I'm glad I came too," I told her, and I meant it completely. She went back to her husband. I watched her walk away, and I thought about the long drive home to Asheville the next morning, and the tomatoes that needed attention, and the walk I would take before sunrise along the trail behind my house, where the light comes through the trees in a particular way that I have never been able to adequately describe to anyone. My father touched my arm. "Ready?" "Almost," I said. "Here is what I've come to understand about the evening, in the weeks since it happened." My father didn't give that speech to humiliate Christopher. Though Christopher was humiliated, he didn't give it to vindicate me, though I felt something like vindication. He gave it because he is a man who spent his entire life watching how people behave when they believe no one important is watching. And he had watched long enough. He had funded their catering. He had arranged their venue. He had contributed to the college education that gave Vanessa her degree and the professional network that gave Christopher his first significant job. He had done all of it quietly, through the trust, without expectation of acknowledgement, because he believed, and I believe this too, that what you do for people you love shouldn't require a receipt. But there is a difference between not requiring acknowledgement and tolerating contempt. My father understood that distinction with the precision of a man who had navigated every variety of human transaction over 8 decades, and he had made his decision the way he made all his decisions, deliberately, with evidence, and without reversibility. The estate documentation was filed the following Monday. Dennis Carver delivered the full report to my father's attorney that same week. I won't go into every detail of what the report contained, but I will say that the conversation Vanessa and Christopher had about the Savannah condo, the conversation in which Christopher suggested that having the property in his name would simplify things if anything happened to the old man, was recorded clearly on page 14. My father read it, had his attorney note it, and moved on. He is not a vengeful man. He's something more precise than that, a man who simply ensures that information is accurate and decisions are informed. In the months following the wedding, I spoke to Vanessa 3 times. The conversations were cautious, exploratory, the way conversations are between people who are trying to find out whether there is still a foundation under a relationship or only the memory of one. I don't know yet what they'll amount to. I'm patient. I believe in patience, the way my father believes in it, not as passivity, but as the long game. Christopher called me once, about 6 weeks after the wedding. The call lasted 4 minutes. He asked how I was doing. He said the wedding had been a great evening. He said he hoped there were no hard feelings about the whole seating thing. He laughed once, briefly, in a way that had lost most of its confidence. I told him there were no hard feelings. That's true. Hard feelings require ongoing energy, and I've never had much interest in spending energy on things that have already resolved themselves. My father flew back to Atlanta the morning after the wedding. He called me from the car service, as he always does when he travels, to confirm he'd arrived safely and to tell me the tomato question had been bothering him. And he'd looked it up, and the eggshells did, in fact, work. But I needed to crush them, fine, not coarse. Coarse doesn't break down fast enough, he said. I'll crush them fine, I said. Good, he said. Come visit me next month. I want to show you the updated trust documentation in person. I'll be there, I said. I drove home from Charleston the next morning in my F-150. 9 hours. I stopped once for gas and a coffee in a small town in South Carolina, where a man at the pump told me my truck was a good truck, and I agreed with him. I got back to Asheville before dark. I walked the trail behind my house, while there was still a thin line of light above the ridge. I thought about my father. I thought about Vanessa. I thought about the way the chandelier light had caught the crystal glasses, and the moment Christopher's voice had carried across the room, and the particular quality of my father's expression when he'd made his decision. I thought about what it means to be a man who doesn't argue, who doesn't perform his value for people who aren't ready to see it, who drives 9 hours and sits at table 14 and eats his dinner and waits, not because he has no power, but because he understands something about timing that impatient people never figure out. The light was almost gone by the time I got back to the house. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink. I put on the coffee. I looked out the window at the garden and made a note to check the tomatoes in the morning. The check for $3,000 was still in my glove compartment. I'd forgotten to give it to them. I decided I would mail it anyway. That's the kind of man I am. Not because anyone is watching, not because it changes anything about what happened, but because when I tell myself a story about who I am, I want it to be accurate. My father taught me that. He taught me most of the things that have mattered. And on a Saturday evening in October, at a table near the kitchen entrance of a plantation estate outside Charleston, surrounded by strangers and ignored by the people who should have known better, everything he ever taught me sat quietly in my chest and waited for the moment it was needed. It didn't wait long.